Peace and love, family. Welcome back, family. And thank you to all the new viewers for tuning in. Today, we're deep diving into the origins that shaped the reality of so called black people, or the Moors, as they were known before they reclassified as black, Negroes, colored, and African Americans. These colonial laws, like the 1669 Casual Killing Act, didn't just strip our ancestors of their humanity, they laid the groundwork for systematic oppression that still impacts us today. From police brutality to legal inequalities, these laws are not just history, they're the root of the struggles we face in the present. Stay with me as we uncover the truths and connect the dots between the past and now. Peace and love, family.
On behalf of Akuno Senko for Bay, you know what I'm saying? Jay, where you at? We're trying to help our people elevate. Hope. H-O-P-E. We're giving them hope. We doing what we gotta do, you know? Every day, one step at a time, man. We gonna make it happen. Helping our people elevate. Yeah. Sometimes I practice focus, thought, and meditate. I'm trying to come with other ways to help our people elevate and seeking knowledge, make me levitate. The lifted mental state is what results from how we orchestrate. This for the family's sake. Let's self-reflect and self-evaluate. And every day, make sure the steps you take, you calculate. Receive a master's fate. I know I can't exist without the hate, but that's okay. I balance that with higher self today. Success is on this way, and after that, my flesh can pass away.
All right, so before we dive deep into this, there's four reasons that I feel like I wanted to bring this topic of discussion up. And so first, you have the legacy of reclassification. So before we dive into these laws, it's important for us to remember that the Moors were once recognized as sovereign people. They were systematically reclassified as black, Negroes, colored, African Americans. This deliberate reclassification stripped them of their rights, identity, and connection to their true history. These laws were designed to uphold systems of oppression that still ripple through society today. And what was the purpose of these colonial laws? Colonial laws like the 1669 Casual Killing Act weren't just tools of punishment. They were the foundation of a legal system that dehumanized enslaved people, protected slaveholders, and ensured that oppression was written into law. These laws served to normalize violence and deny justice to an entire group of people. And the system's impact on these laws that affect us today. These laws didn't just appear, they evolved. Modern day issues like police brutality, mass incarceration, and racial profiling have roots in these legal frameworks. What we're about to explore is not just history, it's the origin of many struggles faced by so-called black people in America today. So this is my call for us to focus on the truth and going into 2025. As we move into this presentation, I encourage you to think critically about how these laws were justified, how they shaped the world we live in, and why reclaiming this knowledge is so essential to understanding our present and shaping our future. On October 20th, 1669, the Virginia Colonial Assembly enacted a law that removed criminal penalties for enslavers who killed enslaved people resisting authority. The Assembly justified the laws on the grounds that the obstinance of many enslaved people cannot be suppressed by others than violent means. The law provided that enslavers' killing of an enslaved person could not constitute murder because of the premeditated malice element of murder could not be formed against one's own property. In subsequent years, Virginia continued to reduce legal protections for enslaved people. In 1723, the Assembly removed all penalties for the killing of enslaved people during corrections, meaning that an enslaved person could be killed for an offense as minor as picking bad tobacco. The willful or malicious killing of an enslaved person could constitute murder in theory, but the law excused the killing of an enslaved person if the killing wasn't in any way provoked. In effect, enslavers could kill enslaved people with impunity in colonial era Virginia, and the situation was similar in most other colonial territories. Following the American Revolution, many states created penalties for killing enslaved people, but the loophole permitting the killing of an enslaved person during correction or to prevent resistance remained. As a result, throughout the course of slavery in this country's history, enslavers were rarely punished for killing enslaved people.
So giving correction shall be acquitted of all punishment and accusation for the same, as if such accident had never happened. So that means that if you happen to be correcting someone and you beat them to death, you know how hard it is to beat someone to death? I mean, I thought about that. I said it happens so frequently that they created a law so that you wouldn't feel any what? No guilt, because you were simply correcting them. It wasn't your fault. So I went back to look at who was beating folks to death. I wanted to know. And it was white women. White women were beating black children to death. That's who was being beaten to death. But it wasn't her fault.
Negro women's children to serve according to the condition of their mother, 1662. In the act, Negro women's children to serve according to the conditions of their mother, passed by the General Assembly in the season of December of 1662, Virginia's colonial government attempted to better define the conditions by which people were enslaved or free. This was a reversal for the usual common law presumptions, that the status of the child was determined by the father. The act enabled the reproduction of one's own labor force. So in its essence, this law declared the status of a child would follow the status of their mother. If the mother was enslaved, then the child would also be enslaved, regardless of their father's status. It ensured the general perpetuation of slavery, providing an economic incentive to exploit enslaved women and their children.
In 1662, that a law was passed that would shape the very fabric of American slavery. This law declared that children born to enslaved women would inherit their mother's status. This may seem like just another law, but its implications were profound. Before this, the status of a child was often uncertain, sometimes even freed through the father's status. But with this law, Virginia cemented hereditary slavery, ensuring that the institution would perpetuate through generations.
The Virginia Slave Code of 1705. As Virginia entered the new century, the legislators set out to make slavery laws in a way it hadn't before. The new law was the most detailed slave code the colony had produced yet, and would vastly strengthen the institution. The following laws was not the first version of Virginia slave codes, but earlier laws were very incomplete. In 1662, 1667, 1682, and 1693, Virginia had passed various parts of the slave codes, including the 1662 law that made enslaved status hereditary through the mother. A 1667 law declared that baptism did not free slaves. A 1682 law allowed the enslavement of Indians. A 1693 law was at first about runaways on outlying plantations, but after revising by the upper house, Virginia's council, it added disturbing new languages that dictated that mulatto children of white women and Negro men to be bound to indentured servant for 31 years. It also punished those white women with either a hefty fine or, if they could not pay it, with a whipping and servitude themselves for 5 years. Before 1705, there were many attempts to pass a more comprehensive code in Virginia, one loosely modeled by the Barbados codes. Earlier drafts were prepared in the 1690s, but portions were voted by the Board of Trade. This revised version finally passed only after King William died, after Governor Francis Nicholas was recalled, and after Queen Anna ascended to the throne. In 1705 and 1706, the new royal governor died on the way to Virginia, and Edmund Jennings, who had immigrated to Virginia first with the patronage of James, Duke of York, became president of Virginia's council, so he was acting governor. Before the onset of the 18th century, the terms slave and servant were sometimes used interchangeably, and the difference in the conditions of white indentured servants and black servants were not well defined. In an act concerning servants and slaves, are the two categories distinct here? What issues are emphasized to distinguish the two groups? Is race explicit? Are any categories used to distinguish rights? Could both groups be whipped naked, for example? Under what circumstances could a servant or slave petition a justice of the peace? Is there a difference? What roles were the church wonders of the parish supposed to play? What does the 1705 code say about the property and people? Could masters kill their servants, slaves? 4 years earlier, in 1701, the Chief Justice of England, John Holt, ruled in a case known as Smith versus Brown and Copper, and declared, as soon as a Negro comes into England, he becomes free. One may be a villain in England, but not a slave. Do you see any reaction to that ruling in the Virginia slave codes?
This meant that from the moment of birth, a child's fate was sealed, bound to the status of their enslaved mother. Imagine the fear, the uncertainty, and the heartbreak. Enslaved women knew that their children would live and die in bondage with no hope for a different future.
In 1740, in the wake of the Stono Rebellion, South Carolina enacted the Negro Act. This law severely restricted the freedoms of enslaved people and codified harsh punishments, further entrenching the system of racial oppression.
It was early morning on Sunday, September 9, 1739. While most of South Carolina's settlers were preparing for church, nearly 24 slaves gathered near the Stono River, less than 20 miles from Charleston. After attacking a local store to secure firearms, the group moved south towards St. Augustine, Florida, swelling in numbers and spreading terror along the way. The rebels killed more than 20 settlers and set numerous buildings on fire before being defeated by colonial militia at the Edison River the following day. This unprecedented insurrection rocked the colony to its core and brought about legislation with important implications for literacy in the colonies that became the United States. The Stono Rebellion was quickly struck down, but it remained the largest slave uprising in the British colonies. In response, the South Carolina General Assembly in 1740 amended the existing slave codes to enact the draconian Negro Act. The original document is housed in the South Carolina Department of Archives and History and contains a passage of special interest to scholars of the early colonial and African American literature. The small but important statute prohibits slaves from learning to read and write, whereas the having of slaves taught to write or suffering them to be employed in writing may be attended with great inconveniences Be it therefore enacted by the authority aforesaid, that all and every person and persons whatsoever who shall hereafter teach or cause any slave or slaves to be taught to write, or shall be used or employ any slaves as a scribe in the manner of writing whatsoever, hereafter taught to write, every such person and person shall for such offense forfeit the sums of £100 current money. The killing while correcting doctrine. Many colonies and later the United States passed laws allowing slaveholders to kill enslaved people if it occurred during discipline or correction. In North Carolina in 1798, a law stated that the killing of an enslaved person would only be considered a crime if it was proven to be malicious. Killing during punishment was exempt. The 1798 North Carolina Arrest Proclamation, signed by William Johnson and Tom Christmas, served as a frightening illustration of how the lives of all black slaves or free could be threatened. The Arrest Proclamation, which today is featured as an artifact in the Kinsey Collection being showed at the Florida A&M University, amounted to the death sentence with its words, "Any person may kill and destroy said slaves." The piece depicts a public official announcement about two escaped slaves. Bernard Kinsey, co-owner of the Kinsey Collection, explains that the proclamation looking for the last two slaves was similar to the fugitive slave laws of the 18th century. The laws, he said, took all the rights from enslaved African Americans. It allowed them to be captured or killed on sight. The significance of this is that we had no rights, we became property.
Enacted a law removing criminal penalties for people who killed slaves that resisted authority. That practice would not be considered murder because the, quote, premeditated malice, unquote, element of murder could not be formed against one's own property.
The Fugitive Slave Act were a pair of federal laws that allow for the capture and return of runaway enslaved people within the territories of the United States. Enacted by Congress in 1793, the Fugitive Slave Act authorized local governments to seize and return escapees to their owners and impose penalties to anyone who aided in their flight. Widespread resistance to the 1793 law led to the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which added more provisions regarding runaways and levied even harsher punishments for interfering in their capture. Fugitive Slave Acts were among the most controversial laws of the early 19th century.
Beginning as early as 1643, fugitive slave laws began dotting colonial law books, including a 1705 law in New York designed to prevent runaway slaves from escaping to freedom in Canada, while Maryland and Virginia passed laws that offered bounties for the capture and safe return of runaway slaves.
The black man in this jail cell has been locked up for refusing to sign a labor contract. Under the Black codes, he is considered a vagrant. Freed people had to sign labor contracts to work for whites or be convicted of vagrancy and fined. If they couldn't pay the fine, they could be auctioned off to the highest bidder, for whom they had to work for a year.
Black codes were restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans and ensure their availability as a cheap labor force after slavery was abolished during the Civil War. Though the Union victory had given some 4 million enslaved people their freedom, the question of freed black people's status in the post-war South was still very unresolved. Under black codes, many states required black people to sign yearly labor contracts. If they refused, they risked being arrested, fined, and forced into unpaid labor. Outrage over black codes helped undermine support for President Andrew Jackson and the Republican Party.
Black codes established certain rights for free people, but in many ways, the laws treated black people like slaves and tried to re-establish white supremacy. Passage of the first Civil Rights Act in 1866 granted citizenship to black men, invalidating the black codes. And by 1868, most states had repealed them.
Slave codes and laws like the Casual Killing Act were often justified by pseudo-religious and racist ideologies. These ideologies dehumanized black people as inferior beings and promoted slavery as a moral and economic necessity. As we reflect on this journey through history, it's clear that the struggles of our ancestors and the systems built to oppress them still echo on the lives of the so-called black people or Moors today. This isn't just about reclaiming our past, it's about reclaiming our narrative, understanding the forces that shaped our reality, and breaking free from the chains of ignorance and misrepresentation. I want to thank you for being part of this conversation, because together we're uncovering the truth and planting the seeds for change. If this resonated with you, don't keep this knowledge to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Make sure you subscribe and hit that like button and leave a comment below. Your voice matters, and it's through these conversations that we could truly elevate and empower our people. Until next time, stay informed, stay inspired, stay connected. Peace, love, and progress to you all.